So today we're going to talk about Pride and Prejudice by the English writer Jane Austen. Pride and Prejudice was published in 1813 and is one of the most popular English classics. Now, what I call the Jane Austen paradox is that while she was alive, Jane was a private person with a small provincial life, and now Jane Austen is as much part of the literary canon as writers such as Shakespeare or Milton. Like most women at the time, Jane was relegated to the home to having a domestic life. In fact, all her novels were published anonymously during her lifetime. As you know, in the 18th and 19th century, books written by women were published either anonymously or under a male pseudonym. The reasoning behind that was that no one, not even other women, would want to read anything written by a woman. We know very little about Jane Austen's life, but we do know that despite the importance marriage has in her books, which I think reflects how important the institution of marriage was in the late 18th and early 19th century in England, Jane Austen never married. Jane was the seventh of 8 children. She had a slightly older sister, Cassandra, with whom she was extremely close. The rest were boys. Her father was an Anglican reverend. The Austens belonged to the lower gentry. In England, the gentry is the social class immediately below the nobility, so not quite dukes, counts, or earls, but one peg or two below them. There is a fascination around Jane Austen because her books are incredibly popular classics. And to my knowledge, her books have never been out of print. Austen's novels have always been popular, and from the 20th century onwards, they have begun to be adapted into TV series and films. I am not naive. I know that many people read Austen's novels because of the love stories contained therein. So are Austen's novels the precursors of modern romance novels? I don't know. I'm not a reader of that particular genre, but I know that Austen's novels have influenced contemporary writers. And I am thinking here of Bridget Jones's Diary, for instance. I am also sure there are many other novels, romance novels, inspired by Austen's writing. Perhaps Jane Austen's most popular novel is Pride and Prejudice. Now, to discuss Pride and Prejudice, you need to understand the importance of marriage as an institution in the 18th and 19th century England. For women of Austen's class, marriage was a matter of survival. Because women couldn't earn a living or own property, they had to marry men who would earn enough to support them and eventually their children. Now, for a woman at the time, staying single meant being supported by her family, either by her father or another male relative. So, to put it bluntly, single women were a financial burden. And Jane Austen never married. We know there were proposals too, I think, but she turned them down. That means that Jane Austen was herself always financially dependent on her family, first on her father and then on her brothers. And therefore, as I'll explain later, money is very important in her novels and in Pride and Prejudice in particular. So now imagine a family with 5 daughters and what a financial burden and worry that would be for the family. Now that's the Bennets in Pride and Prejudice. Mrs. Bennet's main preoccupation in life is finding suitable husbands for her daughters Jane, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, known as Kitty, and Lydia. The heroine in Pride and Prejudice is the second to oldest daughter, Elizabeth Bennet. Although some readers may see Elizabeth as a different kind of literary heroine, I think that Jane Austen was a rather conservative writer in her worldview. I don't think Jane Austen meant to change the society of her time with her books. Yes, Elizabeth Bennet is as independent, with a lot of quotation marks around that word, as an English woman of her class could have been in the late 18th and early 19th century. But I do think that what Austen does here is criticize some of the aspects of English society from the inside without calling for a revolution. Austen was a member of the gentry, and that's also the social class her main characters belong to in her novels and in Pride and Prejudice. So we can say that Austen writes about what she knows, and I would say that is one of the most fascinating aspects of her fiction. Her books are our key as modern readers to a world that hasn't completely disappeared yet, at least not in its essence. But the central irony in Pride and Prejudice and Austen's other novels is that she doesn't want change. She doesn't wish for a revolution in English society, and yet she criticizes that very society. The context in which Jane Austen wrote Pride and Prejudice is the Napoleonic Wars in Europe and Britain's expansion as a global empire. She, however, Austen, chooses to focus on the individual at home in England. War with France abroad also affected life at home, and that is the world that Austen's novels reflect. If we read Pride and Prejudice merely as a romance novel, I think we would miss out on all of that. The narrative is definitely not set in an ahistorical bubble alienated from what was going on in the world at the time, far from it. But what is Pride and Prejudice, and why is it so popular? There's the love story between Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy, of course. I think contemporary readers can see themselves in those two characters and perhaps in other characters in the novel. Surprisingly, Jane Austen's world is not all that different from ours, and I think that explains why some of her books have been adapted in late 20th century and perhaps also early 21st century contexts. I am not just thinking of Bridget Jones, but also I'm thinking of the popular movie Clueless, starring Alicia Silverstone, which was a free adaptation of Austen's novel Emma, but is set in late 20th century California, for example. Now, Pride and Prejudice is particularly easy to adapt to TV and film, I think, because Jane Austen uses dialogue a lot, and the dialogue between the characters is often so witty that screenwriters can just copy and paste it. Now, the historical and political context may be interesting, but I think what fascinates most readers about Pride and Prejudice is the male-female relationship between an intelligent woman who is perhaps too quick to judge and the prototype of the perfect guy, or Mr. Right, who is wealthier and better looking than she is and can therefore elevate her status and guarantee financial stability. And not only. Pride and Prejudice is a story of social mobility through marriage. For better or worse, that's still relevant and it continues to appeal to readers. Jane Austen, I think, hit on a key that continues to resonate with us. And believe it or not, people continue to get married to improve their socioeconomic status. I certainly know people like that. But it's important to notice that Austen is not the first writer to talk about that in English literature. We can go back to the 18th century and find examples of similar stories. For instance, we have Pamela, published in 1740, and Clarissa, published in 1748, both by Samuel Richardson. Because of her intelligence and her unique, often ironic point of view, Elizabeth Bennet is an endlessly fascinating character. Elizabeth is smart, and ultimately she gets everything she wants. She marries for love, but also her marriage is socially and financially advantageous to her. And isn't that the dream? One of the surprising elements of this book, at least to me, is how bluntly money and marriage as means to improve one's situation are discussed. It is not like those things are not as important now as they were then, with the key caveat that now women are not only allowed to, but also expected to work and make money outside the home. But we just don't tend to talk about marriage that way anymore. I think now most people would consider discussing marriage as a means for financial stability uncouth, or at least tasteless. Or we might talk about it even, but in a more coded way. But back then and there, it was all about dollars and cents. Or pounds and shillings. Apart from romance and witty dialogue, there's a clever mix of humor and drama in Pride and Prejudice that makes the novel a light, pleasurable read. So let me know if you have read Pride and Prejudice and what you think about it in the comment section below. And if you are a Jane Austen fan, I'd love to hear what your favorite novel of hers is and why. That is all from me. I hope to see you again very soon with another book review. Bye for now.